In our last video, we talked about the chaotic and controversial election of 1968, which saw a victory by the Republican candidate Richard Milhous Nixon. Today, we're going to talk about the chaotic and controversial administration of Richard Milhous Nixon. As a quick review, the election of 1968 had three main candidates: the Republican, Nixon, advocating for law and order. That's going to be ironic. He advocated for the silent majority of Americans who he said he represented. He was against the Democratic candidate, the Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey, a weak candidate from an extraordinarily divided party. And then there was the spoiler, George Wallace, former Democrat, but current segregationist, former governor of Alabama, who advocated for segregation, who opposed the direction that the Democratic Party was taking in regards to civil rights, and he won over a lot of voters from the South, white voters who felt abandoned by the liberal, pro-civil rights Democratic Party. The election's a mess, and in the end, Nixon is going to come out on top by a very slim margin. When he comes to office, he's got a lot of problems, but none more pressing than the Vietnam War, which we've talked about before. When discussing Nixon's foreign policy in regards to Vietnam, it is important to understand that he's got his right-hand man, that handsome gentleman right there, Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor. Essentially, foreign policy is going to be run out of the White House by Kissinger and Nixon. This is a very hands-on approach. How are they going to deal with Vietnam? Well, during the campaign, Nixon talked about the need for peace with honor in Vietnam. The United States of America was not going to tuck our tail and run. We were a world superpower, and there needed to be peace in Vietnam, but it wasn't going to come at any cost. We were going to maintain our honor. What did that mean? It meant Vietnamization, a plan that Nixon and Kissinger dream up, which essentially called for gradual withdrawal of American troops so that combat operations could be taken over by the South Vietnamese military and government, with the United States taking more of a support role. This was the plan, and sure enough, in 1969, some of the troops start coming home. 25,000 here, 25,000 later, and over the course of several years, thousands and thousands and thousands of American troops are coming home. But at the same time that Nixon is ending the war by bringing soldiers home, he's actually escalating the war by expanding it to places beyond where it currently existed. In April of 1970, President Nixon announced that he had ordered troops to invade Cambodia, a neighboring country to Vietnam. Later, the United States is going to attack supply routes in Laos, another neighboring country. Why is the U.S. military doing this? Because the North Vietnamese are using supply trains, supply routes through those neighboring countries as a way of getting into South Vietnam on the famed Ho Chi Minh Trail. So yes, Nixon's ending the war in Vietnam, but he's also escalating it to a point that it had never been to before. And this is going to be controversial. It is most controversial with the folks for whom the Vietnam War had always been controversial. Young Americans, college students. After all, it is young Americans that are being drafted and sent to fight in Vietnam. Protests break out across the country on many, many college campuses. Many times those protests are peaceful. Other times they are not. And there's no better example of that than what happened at Kent State University in Ohio. There were days of anti-war protests. They began to get chaotic. Eventually, the ROTC building is targeted and burned. The National Guard is called in to try to bring some peace. Protesters begin throwing rocks and bottles and other things at the National Guardsmen, and for whatever reason, the Guardsmen open fire into the protesters, injuring quite a few of them, but ultimately killing 4 students. Shortly thereafter, a few days later, at Jackson State University, a predominantly African-American university, there again are anti-war protests. The National Guard are called in. Students throw things at the Guardsmen. The Guardsmen open fire. And in this case, 2 students are killed. This is what Vietnam has become in the United States of America. Not only are people dying On the other side of the world, as a result of this war, Americans are dying at home as well, and they're being killed by representatives of their own government. The Vietnam War is controversial. But interesting enough, public opinion polls showed that many Americans thought that the National Guard was acting in the right. Perhaps these were the silent majority that Nixon had been appealing to all along, who were not represented by the chaos that they were seeing on TV throughout the 1960s and into the 70s. In 1972, the war's got to come to an end, or so most Americans believe. Nearly 60% of Americans said it's time to get out of Vietnam, one way or another. And 1972 is an important year because this is an election year for President Nixon. He's running for re-election. In October, just a few weeks before the November election, Henry Kissinger announces that peace is at hand. It will be here any moment. Sure enough, the next month, Nixon is going to be reelected in a landslide that we'll take a look at later. But then in December, peace talks break down. They break down regarding what role the United States will play, whether or not the North Vietnamese were going to have to remove all their troops from the South, so on and so forth. All these sort of things. And apparently peace is not at hand. And so President Nixon orders an unprecedented bombing of North Vietnam. More bombs dropped over the course of a few days than in entire wars. And this is known as the Christmas bombing because it's all happening around Christmas, and he bombs the North back to the negotiating table. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords are signed and the United States withdraws from Vietnam. This does not bring an end to the conflict. This does not bring an end to the tension. But for all intents and purposes, for the United States of America, the war is over. The troops are coming home. We are withdrawing. But for the people living in Vietnam, there's still a long way to go. President Nixon, for his part, promises the president of South Vietnam that if the North tries anything, the United States will return. But it just so happens when the North does invade the South and their capital, Saigon, does fall, the United States does not intervene, and Vietnam is going to fall to communism and be reunited under one regime. The United States did not get involved because President Nixon is no longer in office in 1975 because of some events we'll talk about later. What happens after the North takes over the South? More than 1 million are going to flee the country. Hundreds of thousands are going to be sent to labor camps, and it is certainly a very sad scene in Vietnam. And the one thing that we went to war to supposedly prevent, the spread of communism, happens. Vietnam is a controversial war, and the legacy of it lives with us to this day. Beyond the unbelievable financial cost, there, of course, is the cost of human life. 58,000 Americans die in this war. More than 2 million Vietnamese die in this war. Beyond that, it destabilizes an entire region of Southeast Asia. No place more so than in Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge are going to take over this radical communist regime that institutes genocide. What does it do to us at home? Well, there's a new sense of cynicism that Americans have when viewing their government and their military and the media after years of feeling like they've been lied to by multiple administrations, Democrat and Republican. Americans are going to view their government through a different lens than ever before. There's also issues with veterans. The men and women who came home from Vietnam were not given the hero's welcome that previous generations of soldiers had been. They're not going to be given the support. They're not going to be appreciated for their sacrifice on behalf of the United States of America. A very high and very unfortunate percentage are going to deal with mental health issues and physical health issues, homelessness, any number of things that plagues a high percentage of these veterans, due in no small part due to the lack of support that so many in society showed them. The war is also going to be the catalyst for the 26th Amendment being ratified. The 26th Amendment officially across the board throughout the United States lowered the voting age to 18. The feeling was if you were old enough to be drafted to go and fight and die, you ought to be old enough to vote for the people who make those decisions. And finally, it altered the way that Americans viewed foreign policy and presidential power. This war began with Congress giving a blank check to President Johnson. And prior to that, even, President Kennedy and others had sent advisors in, and both Johnson and Nixon had expanded the war. What was the role of Congress in all of this? How powerful should a president be? These are questions that we're still dealing with today. Vietnam is not the only place where Nixon's foreign policy is important. There's also his relationship with the other communist regimes in the world, China and the Soviet Union, who really, even though they're both communist nations, they've got kind of a rivalry for leadership of the communist world. During this period of time, there's going to be something known as détente, or a relaxation, an easing of tension between the United States and communist countries. This is what Nixon is going to pursue, which is odd because Richard Nixon cut his teeth in Congress, made his name as being a ferocious opponent of communism. But here he is as president, reaching out, trying to have peaceful coexistence with communist nations. This is first evident in China, a nation that, of course, we did not recognize, we did not trade with, we had tremendous disagreements with. It begins with ping-pong diplomacy when American and Chinese table tennis teams compete in a series of matches, and then leads to an official diplomatic visit. This is actually not all that odd that nations that are have tension between them will have some sort of a cultural or athletic exchange before more serious work. President Nixon goes and he visits China. He shakes the hand of Chairman Mao, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. And they began the long process of working toward normalizing relations between the United States and China. And of course, today, the United States and China are trading partners, and we have so much of our economies and our diplomacy is interwoven. But it all starts at this time. While this is happening, it gets the attention of the Soviet Union. Why are the United States being so nice to China? And so they want to get on the phone as well. And sure enough, later that same year, President Nixon is going to go to the Soviet Union. He's going to visit Moscow, and he's going to walk away with that meeting with meaningful diplomatic achievements. Most importantly, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which is really meaningful diplomatic agreements, treaties that to deal with the issue of the expansion of arms, nuclear weapons in the world. Back home, Nixon is going to pursue a number of conservative policies that we're not going to have time to get into today, but none more important than his impact on the judiciary, the judicial branch. Many conservatives were upset with what they viewed as liberal or progressive decisions by the Warren Court, the Supreme Court that existed in the 50s and 60s. And Nixon is looking forward to appointing some conservative justices. And he gets just a gift when 4 Supreme Court justices decide to retire during his first term, meaning he can appoint all of them, including the Chief Justice. He is going to replace Chief Justice Warren, who retires, with Chief Justice Berger, and there's going to be this conservative court. However, even though it is far more conservative than Warren Court, it doesn't go about simply overruling or overturning all previous decisions from the supposed liberal court before it. In fact, they uphold a number of liberal decisions, so-called liberal decisions, dealing with things like school busing, for example, but also probably the most controversial of all Supreme Court decisions in the modern era, Roe versus Wade, was decided during this period of a conservative court. Roe v. Wade, of course, is the court decision which allows women to have access to an abortion. But if people know anything about Richard Nixon, the one word that comes to mind for most people is Watergate. But what is Watergate? Well, it's very complicated. We're going to try to make it as simple as we can and cover it as quickly as we can. Watergate is a hotel. That's the hotel right there. But it's actually a hugely complicated scandal involving cover-ups and firings and protecting presidential power. Here's the thing about Richard Nixon. He's paranoid. He thinks everyone's out to get him. This is a man who literally has an enemies list of media types and politicians and academics and other people that he thinks are out to ruin him. And it is this paranoia that probably plays into the scandal that's ultimately going to bring him down. In 1972, there is a committee known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, better known as CREEP. And they're going to play a central role in the Watergate scandal. In June of that year, 5 Nixon supporters are caught breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. They were there to steal documents and wiretap the phones to get dirt on the Democrats. They're caught in the act. They are arrested. The White House denies it. No, we have nothing to do with it. These are just a second-rate break-in. But behind closed doors, they are secretly ordering a cover-up and said to the FBI, hey, you really don't need to be paying much attention to this. Throughout the remainder of 1972, most people don't pay much attention. Voters don't care about this minor incident. Really, the only people who are paying attention to it are a couple of reporters, Woodward and Bernstein at the Washington Post, who are keeping it in the news and uncovering more and more information. Here's this interesting thing about the election of 1972. Nixon's people were trying to cheat to win. They didn't need to cheat. Look at that map. That is a landslide. Nixon wins all but one state and the District of Columbia. He crushes his opponent, McGovern. He does it in large part because the war in Vietnam is coming to an end, but also because of what he calls his Southern strategy. As evidenced by 1968, the Democrats have lost the South. The former solid South is no longer in Democratic hands. And so Nixon makes a play for these voters, saying he's not going to be quite so lenient on civil rights activism. He's going to be take a more moderate approach, and he flips those states, many of which have never gone back to the Democratic side. We'll take a step away from Watergate for just a moment to talk about another scandal involving the Vice President, Spiro T. Agnew. You've never heard of Spiro T. Agnew, have you? Of course you haven't. But now you have, so here you go. Spiro Agnew. He resigns in late 1973, about a year after the election, because it turns out he is a crook. He's accepting bribes in exchange for government contracts and those sort of things, and he is going to resign. Why do we care about this? Because the 25th Amendment, which had been ratified a number of years earlier, spelled out how vice presidents are to be replaced if ever there is a vacancy. So early in his second term, President Nixon has to appoint Congressman Gerald Ford, the House Minority Leader, to be his vice president, and he is quickly confirmed. Why do we care about that? Because now we have a vice president who has not been elected by the American people. Interesting. In 1973, early that year, Congress is going to investigate the Watergate break-in. Nixon says, I'm going to cooperate. And he has a special prosecutor appointed, someone within the Justice Department under the Attorney General to look into this. But Congress pushes forward, and they begin interviewing, having testimony by Nixon administration officials. And it is during those interviews, those testimonies, that some officials reveal that, yes, Richard Nixon was involved in this entire thing. Not only that, he personally was involved in the cover-up of the scandal, tried to hide the truth behind the Watergate break-in. Further testimony reveals that if you want to know anything about Richard Nixon, all you got to do is check his tapes. Why? Because he had secretly installed a taping mechanism throughout the White House so that every Oval Office conversation practically is on tape. Phone calls, conversations of people sitting around. And if you want to know what the president knows, check the tapes. Congress says to the president, give us the tapes. We're conducting an investigation. This is our constitutional authority. Nixon says, I'm not giving you the tapes. It's executive privilege. That's my Nixon voice. I'm sorry. What is executive privilege? Essentially when the president doesn't have to cooperate with Congress because it's a national security issue. And he says, these tapes are national security. I'm not giving them over. The special prosecutor takes President Nixon to court. Says, give us the tapes. Nixon tells his attorney general, you fire that prosecutor. The attorney general says no. And so he's fired. His replacement, he resigns as well. This is called the Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon begins firing people because they won't take action to protect him. This is when the first hints of impeachment start coming out. Eventually, the Supreme Court says, you got to turn over the tapes. And sure enough, he does. He's forced. And on those tapes, there's the so-called smoking gun tape. And on that smoking gun tape, Nixon can clearly be heard participating in this cover-up, giving the orders. And that's the nail in the coffin right there. The House of Representatives begins impeachment proceedings. They're going to draw up articles of impeachment to remove the president from office for high crimes and misdemeanors. Had they gone through with it, he would have been impeached. He would have gone on to the Senate, where the Senate would put him on trial, and it's likely he would have been removed from office. However, before he can do that, before any of that can happen, Nixon in August of 1974 resigns, becoming the only president in history to do so. And so he is not impeached, but he is definitely out of office. What does this mean? It means Gerald Ford, the unelected vice president, is now the president of the United States of America. He is widely respected as a moral and decent man, but as an unelected person, he doesn't seem to have a whole lot of credibility and isn't able to accomplish much, and he's got a lot on his plate. Issues with the Soviets, with Vietnam. It is during his time in office that Vietnam finally falls to the communists. And overall, all of these important issues is what will happen to President Nixon. There is still a criminal investigation into the former president. And so Ford makes the fateful decision to pardon President Nixon for any crime that he may have committed associated with the Watergate scandal. This is controversial, but Ford thought it was in the best interest of the country to put this behind us. And so there you have it. Richard Nixon certainly had some accomplishments, certainly was effective in many ways, but ultimately it was his own insecurity, his desire for power and to hold on to that power that brought him down. But the Watergate scandal taught us something, and that was that, in fact, no person is, in fact, above the law, even the President of the United States.